Good afternoon from a sunny Nairobi. My name is Felojin Anumo. I'm with the Association for Women's Rights and Development. And I would like to thank you for joining us for this webinar today. The focus of our webinar is feminist perspectives on corporate accountability and workers' rights. And today we'll focus on the UN binding treaty as part of feminist struggles on corporate accountability and feminist visions for just economies. In terms of the structure of the webinar, I will do a short introduction over what to expect in the next 90 minutes. And then we have a stellar lineup of panelists who will begin to speak to the different issues that we'll raise and bring the perspectives of feminist and workers' rights movements as pertains to corporate accountability. We have about 6 minutes each for the speakers, and they will be presenting their points. After this, we'll open up for question and answer. And for this, we'll be looking at the chat box, as well as monitoring the hashtag Feminist for Binding Treaty on Twitter. So if you're engaging on either of those platforms, we'll be sure to catch your question. Finally, we will have a wrap-up session where the speakers will respond to your questions as well as give their final remarks. Quickly jumping into today's session, I want to introduce the panelists. And with us, we have Fernanda Hoppenham. Fernanda is the co-executive director of PODER and is a Uruguayan Mexican feminist advocate who has been working on economic justice, gender, and human rights issues for over 20 years. Thank you so much, Fernanda, for joining us. Sanam Amen is our second panelist of the day, and she's the program officer at Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, which is an acronym of APLWD. She's been coordinating members' engagement with international processes and building capacity of women in Asia Pacific to advocate for women's fundamental human rights. Thank you, Sanam, for joining us. And I know that you're on travel, so we appreciate that you're able to find time to have this webinar with us. We are joined by Leah Erienyo, who is the Research Advocacy and Movement Building Manager from Akina Mama Africa, which is abbreviated as AMWA. And Leah comes from my neighboring country in Uganda. And she's an African feminist whose current preoccupation is raising consciousness to shift power back to people, raising and to disrupt and dismantle institutionalized injustices. Thank you, Leah, for joining us. And our final speaker of the day as part of the panel is Gemma Friedman. And Gemma is with the Assistant International Relations Officer at Unison. And Gemma has worked on international trade union issues for over 15 years. Currently, she's working with Unison, which is one of the biggest UK public service unions, where she's responsible for business and human rights. Thank you very much. Like I said, we are monitoring the hashtag Feminist for Binding Treaty on Twitter, as well as the chat box. We are also fortunate to have interpretation services, and so you'll be able to pick the channel in terms of your language preference. And if you have any challenges with that, please type in the chat box and we should get back to you. At this point, I would like to introduce the first panelist of the day, and this will be Fernanda. Fernanda, thank you so much for joining us. And Fernanda will be speaking to what is the UN binding treaty and how are feminists engaging in the issue of corporate power, and why should feminists pay attention to these processes? Thank you, Fernanda.
Hi, everyone. Good morning here in the south and west of the continents, and good afternoon on the other side of the ocean. My name is Fernanda Hoppenheim. I'm with PODER, and I'll be talking to you today about, giving a little bit of a framework of what has happened around the binding treaty, the process to create an instrument that hopefully will hold corporations accountable for human rights violations, prevent harm, and give more or better tools in the access to justice for victims of corporate-sponsored human rights violations. But first, I'd like to, share why this is relevant and why we are here. As you might recall, 4 years ago, we had the disaster at Rana Plaza, and that disaster where a building collapsed, killing 1,400, a little bit over 1,400 workers, mostly female, and their kids that were there in care. Happened due to negligence and corruption and all this undue interference that corporations exert over our authorities, our national authorities. We've also seen the disaster that happened both in Brazil and in Mexico with the breaking of dams associated to mines that resulted in the contamination of the river Sonora in Mexico in 2014, and the Rio Doce in Brazil, affecting the community of Mariana in 2015. And those are examples of how companies are affecting human rights, are affecting the environment, are affecting women's rights without being held accountable and without enough instruments for governments to hold them accountable and guarantee that we as affected peoples have access to justice. And all of these were transnational corporations that operate in multiple countries and jurisdictions around the world. The same with Chevron Texaco and the contamination caused by oil drilling in the Equatorian Amazon in Ecuador. And that happened over 3 decades ago, but the communities are still awaiting justice, and the companies have found different channels to avoid being held responsible, being held accountable. So that took us as civil society organizations around the world, as social movements, to start pushing for instruments that could somehow overcome some of those challenges, at least. As these companies grow in size and power, and they work again, transnationally in different jurisdictions, and they get registered under different names, we need some, let's say, international binding instruments that can help us in regulating their operations and their impacts. So in 2014, the resolution 269 passed in July that year in the context of the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the UN Human Rights Council. And it was a tight vote, but in the end, that resolution passed, and that gave its way to the creation of the Intergovernmental Working Group that is in charge of creating this instrument, the binding instrument on TNCs, as we call them, transnational corporations and human rights. So after that resolution passed, then now we've had 3 sessions so far in October 2015, October 2016, and October 2017 of that open-ended intergovernmental working group where any government, any state member of the UN system can participate, not just members of the Human Rights Council, in the discussions and negotiations to create this instrument. And this process is chaired by Ecuador, and the other important leader that has been pushing for it is South Africa. So we have different spaces for participation. The Treaty Alliance is a very broad platform that is composed of over 200 groups, movements, and organizations around the world. And what we detected as feminists in 2015, maybe after a year or 2 years of conversations and negotiations, is that the gender perspective, the feminist perspective wasn't there. That this is a matter that is of utmost importance for women and women's rights and all other identities that are being affected by abuses caused by the operation of these corporations. We see that women have access to more precarious jobs, that women suffer violence within the workplace. When they come and go from the workplace, as we know, there's a lot of violence and sometimes sexual violence and risk that women are always under threat. And we also see the gender pay gap or salary gap. We've also seen that women human rights defenders that are confronting corporations are under higher and different type of risks than male human rights defenders. So bringing all that analysis that we have from all these different spaces and processes and trajectories that we've been walking together, we decided to put together a group that is called the Feminist for Binding Treaty. And this started as a very small group over wines in Geneva, to be frank, and now has become a very broad platform where feminists, both from human rights organizations and from feminist groups or movements or collectives, are participating in, pushing for the inclusion of a gender perspective in the text of the treaty that is now being negotiated, and for the voices of women and the diversity of identities to be brought to the table of negotiations and in the implementation. So I think other colleagues are going to talk more about the particular demands that Feminists for Binding Treaties have that we've put together as priorities. But just to name it, is that we have in due diligence processes not only human rights or environmental impact assessments, but also gender-based impact assessments that we that consider particular risks that women human rights offenders are. So the women human rights offender issue should be as part of the discussions. And also, all that relates to jobs and salary gaps and precarious jobs and working conditions for women and violence in the workplace. So in a nutshell, that's what we're trying to push. That's why this is a not most important issue for feminists, for women, internationally and locally, that are trying to confront corporate power. So thank you. I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Fernanda, for giving us that historical lens and perspective of the road to the binding treaty. And indeed, a feminist collective mobilization in that process has been loud and clear. And thank you also for articulating the asks and the demands for the Feminists for Binding Treaty. And I think we'll be coming back to this again towards the end of the call, just to reiterate the same. And while you have been able to mention some of the reasons why and how feminists, corporate abuses are actually issues of feminist concerns, Leah will actually be talking to us and highlighting how this is the case and how this has been manifested. Thank you so much, and welcome, Leah.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, everybody. My name is Leah from Uganda. It's about 3 p.m. here. I'm quite excited to be part of this panel and very honored to be presenting along these amazing women. So like fellow Jean has said, I'll really just be talking a bit more about why we should care about the abuses that the corporations are perpetrating against workers. So first of all, we have to understand that the majority of women that are actually working within transnational corporations, the majority of workers are actually women. Records show that about 43% of these people, of these women, are actually in vulnerable employment. They face horrendous working conditions. They barely have any pay, and yet at the same time, these are multi-billion-dollar corporations that are making vulgar profits off the backs of these women. So basically what they do is, they take advantage of the already low status of women in society, in situations where they're unable to negotiate better or unable to speak up, and they exploit this for the lowest wage possible. And just like Fernanda mentioned earlier, women actually end up paying the highest price for working for these corporations. She mentioned the Rana Plaza incident, where more than 1,000 people were killed, and thousands of them were also injured, and more than half of the people that were actually killed in that building were women. And this was a company that was intent on finishing an order. This was a building that was already well on its way to collapsing. But security was pushed the wayside, so profit over safety was prioritized. So it's important that then we focus a lens on these corporations and hold them accountable, because the majority of people that are working there are women. Further, again, just like Fernanda mentioned, when we start looking at the impacts of the workings of these corporations, they mostly affect women, The impacts are greatly gendered. I've already talked about the low status of women, and therefore these corporations simply come in and entrench those inequalities further. She talked about the threatening of the lives of human rights defenders, female human rights defenders especially, those who are sexually assaulted. She talked about the disproportionate effect of environmental degradation of women, because they generally are in charge of looking for food and fetching water. So when you have situations of environmental degradation, as is in the Niger Delta, then it means that women are the ones who are bearing the brunt of that. And all the poor work policies that are within the transnational corporations actually end up affecting women the most. Things like pregnancy-related discrimination, where women are unable to access maternity leave, or they're forced to abort, or prevented from starting their own families because companies feel that that is something that will infringe on their profits. Those are all problems that they face. And then to make matters worse, as the women are, some of the women don't even know that these are injustices that are the responsibility of the company, so they don't even lay it at their feet. But even in situations where remedies have been identified and there's been some kind of compensation, women actually aren't considered in situations of land compensation, because in most cultures, women are actually not the owners of land. Then they do not receive justice. So then you definitely see a very systemic feminization of this abuse and feminization of the poverty that actually emanates from that kind of model. So it means that these matters are important to us because we need to look at them through a gendered lens, so that then the mechanisms and the interventions that we look at in order to resolve these issues definitely take into account the gendered impact of this corporate abuse. We also have to look at the sheer size and scope and influence that corporations have. It feels like a new form of imperialism. Corporations have more wealth than quite a number of countries in the world. I read a statistic that Shell made a profit of $484 billion in 2011, which is almost double the GDP of Nigeria, where they got that money. So when you hear numbers like that, that is something that should give you pause. It basically means that these corporations are coming in and reshaping our socio-political and economic landscape because of the influence that they can buy just with their money. And it also means that they're definitely flouting some tax codes and avoiding the payment of taxes, and therefore that's how they're able to accumulate all this wealth. And this shift in power, therefore, means that governments are relegating their duty of responding to the needs of citizens and relegating that duty to corporations. And since corporations are more interested in maximizing profit over anything else, of course, the needs of the citizens are not going to be prioritized. They'll be focusing on privatization and monetization of any service that they're offering. And so that is why you end up with situations where the privatization of hospitals, which means that the cost of access to health is increasing, which affects issues like maternal mortality and maternal morbidity. Health insurance costs are sky high. So all these are things that really should give us pause as feminists, because the all-consuming influence of the transnational corporations is pervasive, it's powerful, and it's insidious. And so that is something that should give us pause and definitely be a call for us to challenge that power. Thank you, fellow Jean.
Thank you very much, Leah. And I mean, I couldn't have said it any better. Just being able to highlight, the obscene amount of profit that certain companies are making over the GDP of certain countries and what that could translate to in terms of political influence. the fact that, young women and girls and gender non-conforming persons are disproportionately affected with corporate abuses, are some of the key reasons why feminists are actually engaging quite a bit in terms of the binding treaty. And while we know that the binding treaty is one avenue in terms of the road to corporate accountability, it is a historic opportunity, like Fernanda said. Just a reminder that we are also still looking out for your questions in the comment box. So if you have your questions, we'll be noting them and reading them out once we've heard from the panelists so that they can also respond. Now we've heard about the historical engagement on the road to the binding treaty. We've heard about why it is imperative that feminists must be concerned with corporate accountability issues, especially as corporate power is on an increase in this day and age. We will hear from Sanam in terms of what needs to be included in the binding treaty. And this is both in terms of the content, but also in terms of the process. Currently, the UN Human Rights Council is convening in Geneva, and one of the reports of the last year's IGWG is being presented, and we already are beginning to hear some disquiet on the EU position. And so from a feminist perspective, what are the key demands in terms of content and process, but also how is the issue of corporate accountability truly cross-movement, and how is it including different movements, including indigenous people? So Sanam.
Thank you so much, Felicine and Marian from AWID and GADN respectively. Since I'm trying to keep to the time and respect it, I will just jump in. And to answer some of Felicine's questions, I really want to explain what my organization, and we have a banner back there, it really is. So APWLD is a regional women's rights organization formed in 1986, emerging out of the Third World Conference on Women. We have two sister women law and development networks in Africa and Latin America, which are WILDAF and GADN. So just there, I put a photo of our secretariat right now. We're growing in numbers, actually. But this next slide, I'm just going to show you if it works. Yeah. No, wait, it jumped. Sorry. So this is the Asia Pacific Feminist Forum. There's over 300 women there, and that sort of represents our membership. We're active in 27 countries in the Asia Pacific region. We're proud to be led by members who are migrants, women with disabilities, indigenous, trade unionists, lawyers, activists, queer persons, and women human rights defenders. And our belief is that change can happen when autonomous feminist movements can thrive. We are intersectional feminists, and we're active in cross-movement collaboration. And that's how I want to sort of explain where our position is coming from. Here, I've just put forward some of the demands that we have from the region, which relate back to our demands for systemic change, for an economic system that does not increase inequality and that redistributes resources so that everybody can have equal opportunities worldwide. So we need a living wage for all. We need a just and equitable transition of the economy in the context of climate change so that the new green economy is a feminist one, and we can see that zero carbon future. And a treaty that addresses corporate accountability like this one that's being proposed, it needs to support these things to really challenge corporate impunity. Now, I just want to also mention that APWLD is a co-convener of the Women Human Rights Defenders International Coalition. And this photo I'm showing you here is showing solidarity to our sisters in the Philippines who are facing threats and judicial harassment from the government. I'm just coming from the International People's Tribunal on the Philippines in Brussels, and it was really a powerful, moving experience to hear the testimonies of women who have been targeted. And it goes hand in hand. The state is targeting them and wants to hand over their land, indigenous people's lands, to mining corporations. That connection is really clear. We see that not just in the Philippines, but many countries across the world, not just in Asia Pacific, that states and corporations collude to take away land and natural resources from communities, to pollute and destroy the environment for profit. And they have no qualms in using the military or paramilitary to secure their property and threaten the lives of human rights defenders. So this complicity of corporations and the killing of defenders is visible worldwide. Now, to explain why corporate accountability is so important, and this treaty is so important for the women in my movement, I'm jumping back to this picture from 2006, where our members are saying, are in this campaign, women say no to WTO. This is rooted in our analysis that capitalism and neoliberal economics are incompatible with feminism. World Trade Organization policies are not pro-people or pro-poor. They promise that by opening up developing economies to investment, by making it easier for big business to operate, that there will be development. But GDP growth is not real development. It has allowed corporations and a small group of individuals to grow an obscene amount of wealth that fellow Jean was just mentioning. It's so much so that, I think Leah was just talking about this right now, 71 out of the top 100 economies in the world are corporations, not countries. So and in that scenario, there's 8 men that own half of the world's wealth. Men, not women. Of those 8, one of the names, apart from Jeff Bezos of Amazon and Bill Gates of Microsoft, is the owner of Zara, Amancio Ortega. And let me remind you that Zara's products are made in countries like Bangladesh, where even 5 years after the Rana Plaza disaster, which Fernanda just mentioned, this disaster that killed over 1,000 workers, those workers today, and I'm speaking of protests that started just 2 days ago, they cannot protest low wages or delayed salaries without being beaten and thrown in jail. The government just announced this week a new minimum wage of $96 per month. Ortega, the owner of Zara, he is not a billionaire because he is a genius. He is not working harder than a Bangladeshi woman in a factory. He is rich because the global economic order allows him to exploit the low wages, lack of labor protections, and a repressive state ready to torture trade unionists and give riot equipment to police so they can tear gas women garment workers demanding a living wage. And it's because of that APWLD, has this position not just on corporate accountability, but on trade and investment agreements. So I'm going to jump to one specific part of the zero draft of the treaty, Article 13, where it mentions future trade and investment agreements shall be interpreted in a way that is least restrictive on their ability to respect and ensure their obligations under this convention, notwithstanding other conflicting rules of conflict resolution arising from customary international law or from existing trade and investment agreements. So, close quote. This is a roundabout way of saying that there should be primacy of human rights over investment. That is to say, human rights come first over any other agreement. And rules of conflict resolution, like the Investor State Dispute Settlement Mechanism, or ISDS, that doesn't have precedence. ISDS is a standard feature of trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership that you can see our members protesting here. And the next photo is our members protesting the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is led by China, but quite similar to the TPP. These multilateral as well as bilateral trade and investment agreements compromise our government's abilities to protect rights. And that's why they end up siding always on this for corporations and to help foreign investment, because it will help growth. But that's not actually the case. And so one of the key things that we think are important in the treaty, and some of that we talked about in our side event last year that I hope we can sort of revive and in the 4th session next month, our feminist demands of these treaties is to explicitly state that there's primacy of human rights over any such trade and investment agreement, that there's an elaboration of extraterritorial obligations. That means across border. You can't just say that, oh, it happened there, so my court can't do anything. To recommend that states conduct ex post and ex ante human rights impact assessment of trade and investment agreements. We also propose the treaty explicitly recognize the right of indigenous people to free, prior, and informed consent. This is a really key principle, and it's already in the UNDRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we also suggest that not only FPIC should be in this treaty, but that if it's not present in the structure of any type of agreement or any sort of contract for a development project, that should be a violation of this treaty. We also want emphasis on corporate capture of the state and state institutions, because that is also a huge challenge, as I've described. And that also should address the use of security forces, military, paramilitary, police, special guards for company premises that were stolen from ancestral land of indigenous people. That you cannot use security forces of the state to attack human rights defenders and communities in order to protect corporations. So those are some of the things that we think are really important and really essential, because I think what we don't realize is that so much is being stolen from us, that people are living in deprivation because other people are rich. It's not because the other people are working harder or are better. I'll stop there and throw back to you, Felicien. Thank you. And that last picture is of us sort of showing solidarity with women human rights defenders fighting against mining companies.
Thank you so much, Sanam, for a very powerful presentation. I mean, you highlight critical issues of how we define wealth without critiquing the sources of wealth, and how that's applauded in the current neoliberal economic model, which is problematic, especially because we begin to appreciate the fact that with this kind of model, the 8 men are able to own half of the world's wealth. The second thing I think you're also highlighting, and is very important to mention, is the corporate capture, and how corporate power is now automatically translating to political power in spaces like the UN, where indigenous voices are not as loud as some of the corporations who are forming coalitions and trying to dissuade the processes that will advance a binding treaty that can regulate them. I want to, at this point, introduce Gemma Friedman, who would actually be speaking from the workers' rights perspective. Gemma, welcome. And before I welcome Gemma, thank you for the questions. I think we are still receiving questions from the floor, so keep them coming. Thank you.
On behalf of the trade union movement, about the binding treaty on business and human rights, and I'll do my best to represent well. First of all, to Unison, my union who I work for, and I want to give you a very quick overview of the trade union movement in general, so you can see our relevancy for those that know less about trade unionism. Unison itself, we represent 1.3 million workers. 1 million of those are women in the UK. We're the biggest trade union now in the UK. Our members are in the public service, both in the actual public state-run services, so our beautiful National Health Service, schools, local authorities, but also we have some in privatised, such as the energy companies, and also in the outsourced sectors of many of our public services, and increasingly so, that have been privatised. So we also have cleaners, caterers, teaching assistant. No, sorry, that's public. Anyway, on top of that, I think it's really important to mention that in the UK alone, £200 billion worth of money is used for public procurement. And so within that, we see that there is a definite responsibility of the public services to have responsibility throughout their procurement and the supply chains. Like the vast majority of unions in the UK, we affiliate to the Trades Union Congress, our umbrella trade union organisation that has a collective voice of over 6 million workers in the UK. And internationally, we are very well networked as well. So we are federated to Public Services International, who have over 20 million public service workers, over 700 unions in 163 countries and territories. As many of you will know, we're run on membership, we're membership fee paying, and we run on democratic accountability lines. And I think it's really important to stress this, because for us, that's what we feel gives us our representicity and our legitimacy. Also, it's what allows us legally within the countries that allow us to actually represent working people. We fight, the trade union movement has fought for years, and the women have fought very, very hard for years for equality within trade unions. And the best of them have 50-50 representation in leadership, and the ones that are catching up have 30% of women's representation. This is all important because actually we are the biggest feminist organisation in the world as a movement, because we have so many female workers who choose to pay our subscriptions. And our history, when you look at maternity protection or equal remuneration, rights to social protection, conventions for domestic workers, our history shows that we are fighting for that, for the feminist agenda all the way. We know that sometimes it's a struggle, but as women inside the trade union movement, we fight both outside of the movement and we fight within our movement to get gender equality and equity. I'll stop there on that bit, probably a bit too long on the introduction. I'm going to try not to repeat what others have said, so I'll be skipping around my notes a bit. So suffice to say that more than 60% of global trade is dependent on contracts in supply chains sourced from different parts of the world, and that there are massive asymmetric power relations that go on, not in favour of workers. We don't have a problem with non-binding instruments such as the UN GPs or the OECD guidelines for multinational companies, and of course we support the Global Supply Chain Roadmap at the International Labour Organization that we have been part of creating, and we hope to have a convention on in the coming years. But we know that these are not binding, and that's the problem. So right from the start, Public Services International were part of the binding treaty, civil society discussions and campaigning, and the International Trade Union Confederation and the International Transport Federation are also coming in behind that and have been active too. Some of the things that we would want to see in the paper, in the text, we are, well, a big concern of ours, which I'm afraid I didn't have sound for the first 20 minutes, so forgive me if I repeated, are about the difference in opinions between South Africa and the EU. And the EU, which wants local businesses to be accountable, and South Africa, who actually back, unlike the EU, the process of the binding treaty, don't. So there's a big problem around scope, and we'll have to work together on that. We want to see labour rights being treated as human rights within the treaty, not just as an other add-on that can then later on maybe be picked off in negotiations. And the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, Article 23, on just and favourable working conditions, is just one of the international legal instruments that gives us that legitimacy for that request. But we're also concerned about that procurement is missing. And that contracts can be awarded as they are to bidders that don't respect human rights. That needs to change. And as outsourcing of public services to the private sector, it needs to be made clear that states do not relinquish their obligations when they privatise. And they should still be able to effectively oversee the enterprise's activities through the provision of adequate independent monitoring and accountability mechanisms. So we want to see explicit mention of those state obligations. I'd also point to the fact that we don't think the draft is strong enough in certain areas, such as international monitoring and complaints procedures. And so, for example, the national implementation mechanisms seem to be modelled around the OECD contact points, which have been created for the multinational guidelines on multinational companies. It is not in the main body of the text, but it's in the protocol. And there's a lot of scepticism about the appropriateness of using this model because most national contact points to date have been ineffective in offering remedy to victims. And that's the main goal of the instrument. So we want to see something that's more robust. We also have issues about wanting, on both the feminist and trade union side, about language on human rights defenders that should be strengthened. We would prefer the term rights holder to victim. Many trade unionists feel that the term victim doesn't always apply to trade unionists when their rights are being impacted. I'll stop there on that, and I'll move on to I will move on to how and why workers and feminists' demands on corporate accountability overlap. So I've said a little bit about this already. If you go to what I think is a good paper, this Leave No One Behind from the UN high-level panel of experts on women's economic empowerment, there is a quote there that globally, well, actually, I'll leave that aside for time's purpose, but it just reiterates what we already know about what's happening to women in the workplace. The ITUC were part of the creation of this, and it is a good paper, unlike some of the others that have come out. For Unison, just to give you a very practical examples, our membership levels, even with a hostile right-wing government, are currently holding up, which is a testimony to all the hard work that the organisers and the members are doing to keep trade unionism alive and actually at a good, strong level after we've been weakened so much since the 1980s. But because we have such a high proportion of female members that fit the low-paid, part-time profiles, so the care workers, we have Unison has the largest number of care workers, the cleaners, the school assistants, etc. That means that our finances are falling. So this agenda, this right-wing agenda, has a deliberate, direct effect on weakening us. And of course, within that, women are the ones that get weakened the most and first. Women are also the biggest users of public services, and we're a public service union, but they're also the providers of the public services. And transnational corporations are providing privatised, low-quality, unaccountable health and education, and that, of course, doubly harms women as workers because their rights are taken away, and then, of course, as the end users. And the tax avoidance and evasion activities doubly harm the quantity and quality of those public services, and then enables the argument that the state is not good enough to be able to run public services, and therefore it should be privatised further. We know that we cannot be a single issue focused. So inside Unison, for example, we have self-organised committees that set our union policy. We have a women's committee, we have a black workers committee, we have an LGBTQI committee, we have disability committees. We also have groups for migrant workers. So there's a Philippine group, there's an African workers group, and there's an EU group. But the thing I want to say here is the common binding factor that binds us all together within all of this is work and class. And so for whether you're on a feminist agenda or a worker agenda, it doesn't matter, because what we're talking about is power relations, and that we need to shift those power relations in the favour of ourselves. And we cannot do this if we just look at single issues. So let me just say a very, very quick thing about the environment. Workers are also the first to experience environmental neglect in the workplace that then impacts on the communities. They are also the ones that live in those communities. I could say more, but I'll stop there. Now, how can we work together and collaborate? I think, united we stand, divided we fall. Whether we have commonalities or whether we have differences, the commonalities we need to enrich and we need to celebrate. And the differences, I think we have to come from some first principles. We need to understand our strengths and weaknesses individually as organisations and movements, and we need through that understanding to add value. So NGOs are often better at campaigns and advocacy than unions, but we often have the mandate in law to be able to represent members to employers, and we also have other channels where we're more effective or have our added value perhaps than NGOs. But that's a good thing because it means that we can enrich each other. But we mustn't step on each other's toes because that is where it gets difficult. Following from that, the way to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I think in the UK certainly it's improved a lot over the years, and I think in other parts of the world it's also improving, is on how we plan together. So none of us should just be coming up with a strategy and plans and then approaching the others to use the others' networks. That can happen quite a lot with NGOs who enthusiastically approach trade unions and say, we've got these brilliant plans and now we want to do X, Y, Z. Can we have access to your members? No, let's start from the beginning together and plan it together. The other thing I would say is, and you know, the UK is you know, we're privileged here that women have fought and won due to particular circumstances, more rights than other parts of the world. And trade unions reflect cultures. And we are all more than well aware that in other parts of the world, the traditional union movement may be overrepresented by men who may be unwilling or just unable to represent women, and especially young women. But that doesn't mean that the trade union organisations cannot change, or that progressive workers can't start more progressive unions. So I would say also when it comes to collaboration, sometimes we can make good things happen in that area. And I would say don't give up on the fundamental role of trade unionism. Adapt it, work with others, allies to make it work. Many will know about Sewa in India, and that's exactly probably the pinnacle of what you can explain, what we have to be able to show just how that kind of thing can happen. They are a bona fide trade union, and they fought against the traditional Indian male-dominated unions that didn't want them to become part of the global trade union movement. And now, you know, they've got their allies, and it works. So I bet I've overrun. So anyway, the last thing I think is it's no surprise that inside of corporate responsibility industry that they prefer to work with women's organisations often than with trade unions as well, just to underscore the importance of working together, because women's organisations can be more vulnerable because maybe there's no membership model of sustainable fees, of sustainable income, and maybe just not as strong as if it's networked together within a movement. And so it's very nice PR to show that they're working with women's movements. And I'm not doing down any of the NGOs. I'm just saying that it makes it more important that we work together so we get fundamental systematic change rather than on specific single issues that don't address the underlying causes of the power imbalance. So we can work together. We already are on policy, on influencing one another's policy, on joining each other's groups, on doing joint advocacy. It's happening in the UK. Unison's part of the Feminists for Running Treating Public Services International have joined as well. So let's just build on each other's richness and our added value. And I'm sorry, I've probably taken way too much time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you so much for raising the critical issues, some of the difficult conversations that we need to have amongst movements, between and amongst movements. And I think it really is true what you say, because we are beginning to see that corporations use certain buzzwords like women's empowerment and gender equality, and often it's an advertising gimmick, and it's actually piggybacked on corporate social responsibility. And yet, if we interrogate this issue much further, we realize that these interventions primarily are focusing on corporations themselves, and have actually been justified to be a smokescreen and one of the ways that corporates are enriching themselves and enriching their profits. So we have to be critical even when we engage them as women movements to work with trade unions who are able to do that more critically and also more systematic. I thank you also for raising the common issues that overlap between workers' rights and feminist rights, which are around the disproportionate impact that transnational corporations have, for example, on the sweatshop jobs that have been raised right from Fernanda through to Sanam and Leah, the issues around tax evasion and tax avoidance, and how this comes back to profit and impacting public services and access of services that might be gender responsive and would benefit the women and more broadly the society. Thank you very much. We're going to move quickly into questions because I've managed to get some questions from the floor, and I'll pose them to the various panelists. The first question will be posed towards Sanam, and there's a question around why shouldn't free, prior, and informed consent apply to all victims of land grabs and other harmful corporate projects? Non-Indigenous women and others should have a right to free, prior, and informed consent. Do they want their land taken or promised, but rarely delivered compensation? So what is the argument, or why the focus on Indigenous people?
So I think the quickest answer to that question is I was really speaking to try and bring together the specific demands coming from the different movements. And FPIC, the acronym for Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, is a specific demand of Indigenous people and it's very important. Now, I'm not saying that those principles can't apply to other sectors, just that that's a specific demand that comes from Indigenous communities, and the principle was developed specific to Indigenous people. So I agree that the principle can apply to all kinds of communities, regardless of their background, and that's why it also comes back to the question of impact assessments, where, for any type of project, whether that's a mine, an energy station, a dam, a highway, all of these projects are going to affect communities, especially in the context of Asia Pacific, where we host 60% of the world's population. So, a lot of the time, some of the conversations that we have are about, you can easily go green if you set up a wind farm, but we don't have the land to set up a wind farm half of the time in some of the smaller countries as well. So, of course, informed consent is important, and one of the ways to make sure that exists is to make human rights impact assessments, environmental impact assessments, and gender impact assessments necessary, and to put conditions in place for those impact assessments, so that a company can't just find some random consultant or pay off one person in the community to sign a waiver, which is what we've been seeing in a lot of countries. Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh come to mind in the sort of corporate land grabs that have been taking place. So those principles can be carried over to impact assessments, as I said, that need to be consultative, independent, and include the voices of the community. So I hope that clarifies the point on a free, prior, and informed consent. Of course, the principles can come across, but I was really raising it as a specific demand of Indigenous peoples. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sanam, for that comprehensive response, and feel free to share links in the chat box if you would want to recommend certain reading or certain reports that participants can review. And we shall be sure also to share it when we share the recording of the webinar. The second question speaks to the politics around the process of the binding treaty, which is also coupled with the previous question around the demands of different constituencies. And so there's two questions that I'm going to pose to Fernanda that are related. One is, which states are supporting the binding treaty and which are against? And what are their reasons for opposing the treaty? But then also, because you're also engaged with the anti-G20 feminist mobilization, there's a question around, how do you see the strength of treaty negotiations with the recent changes in the political scenarios of those participating in this process, with the neoliberal, sexist, xenophobic, etc., vis-a-vis governments in power or soon to be power taking over? How do we connect our strategies for the treaty to macroeconomic conversations and decision-making processes happening at the G20 and with trade arguments that are not paying attention to our treaty priorities? Over to you, Fernanda.
Thank you, fellow Jane, and our participants for those questions. It's great to have the opportunity to maybe share a little bit more about the process in terms of the states that are supporting the elaboration of this binding treaty, that have been constructively engaged, and those that have been opposing or that have a more conservative perspective on the process and the instrument. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the states that are leading the process are Ecuador and South Africa, and they had the support when the resolution 269 passed of interestingly so, some large economies such as China or India, aside of some Latin American countries and some African countries, and some countries in Asia and other regions. But the interesting thing about China, for example, is that when the resolution passed, there was this footnote, that's how they call it, the footnote, that stated that this treaty, this instrument, was going to be focusing on any corporation that has a transnational character. And as you might know, the most large Chinese corporations are state-owned or controlled by the state. So just focusing on TNCs or using that footnote would maybe prevent from this large state-owned corporations to be held accountable, though they operate transnationally as well. So that's yet to be seen, but that's how it was playing out. Maybe a little parenthesis here. It is interesting that if you look at the 5 most valued companies now in the market, the financial and the stock market. So the 5 corporations that have more value are those related to tech or social media and so on, like Amazon, Facebook, Apple, etc., Microsoft. But then when you look at the 5 corporations that have made more profit in the last year, number 1 is Walmart. It's the largest employer worldwide, as you know. And the other 3 in the top 5 are Chinese state-owned companies, energy generating and oil extracting companies. And number 5 is Shell, in case you were wondering. But I think it's interesting to see how this governments that have supported the process, or at least were supportive at the beginning, might shift if we start to look at those large corporations. And nowadays, I would say that there are a few African countries, a few Asian countries, and a few Latin American countries that are supportive of the process and pushing forward. But there's also in the opposing side, or in the more conservative side, we have the largest northern economies, right? So the European Union as a whole has been participating in the process, but has been pretty skeptical of this instrument, and they have been trying to use procediments of procedural obstacles to try and stop the process or delay the negotiations. The US is definitely not participating in a constructive way. Japan either. So, mostly the states where those large transnational corporations have their homes are opposing the process or are delaying the negotiations, or some of them have been slightly moving towards, I would say, the direction we want them to be moving to, due to, for example, civil society pressure in Europe. But this is yet to be seen, and that is why I'm always emphatic of how important it is for us to be participating, engaging, and pushing for this in October 2018. And then quickly on the G20, I think that when we're talking about challenging corporate power and we're talking about understanding how this huge economic powers have an impact on our lives, we should be looking at different spaces. And, you know, the G20 is this pool of very large economies that come together every year and make decisions on macroeconomic policies internationally. So I think that it's important for us as feminists to participate there. We have the Feminist Forum against G20, that it's an open space where anyone can get engaged. Most of the materials is in Spanish because it's happening in Argentina, but we're making a huge effort to have materials in English and hopefully in French as well. And I invite you all to get involved, to get that information on our Facebook or Twitter. It's called Foro Feminista contra el G20. And take a look at it and hopefully get engaged, because whatever is decided in this group of very powerful countries that are also trying to benefit corporations and to bring more investment without accountability mechanisms into our countries has everything to do with what we're trying to achieve in Geneva with the binding treaty. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. And just to reiterate that, yes, the binding treaty is actually just one of the tools that can be used for corporate accountability. It's not the end all and be all. And so making these linkages to very important processes such as the feminist mobilization around anti-G20 is key. A question that is coming up as well, and I want to raise it to Leah, is around those of us who have been following are aware that there's actually the UN guiding principles. And so what are some of the, would I say critique, or what are some of the things in the binding treaty that would reinforce what the guiding principles that are voluntary for corporate accountability?
I'm sorry, fellow June, you broke up there. Is the question written somewhere? Because I didn't hear it.
Okay, so I'll just repeat it also for the sake of translation. What are some of the advantages of the binding treaty that could possibly reinforce the UN guiding principles, which is actually a voluntary framework where transnational corporations are actually supposed to report against? And I think coupled on that, a question that I've sent to you is around pharmaceutical companies, because you'd raised the issue of healthcare and how that is being increasingly privatized. So what are some of the mechanisms that we can actually bring to redress such corporations?
Is, just like you've rightly mentioned, is that corporations will no longer be self-regulating, which was really just, in my opinion, a laughable attempt at holding them accountable, because it is very difficult to tell an entity whose primary interest is actually profit to self-regulate, and that's why instead of doing what was actually expected of them, they were carrying out cosmetic PR actions through the corporate social responsibility services. So I think that corporate social responsibility activities. So I think that this treaty definitely presents an opportunity for their feet to be held to the fire, and for there to be the beginning of actual transformation that will better and promote women's lives, as opposed to just having surface and cosmetic work. The other question is around pharmaceuticals. I'm sorry, I missed it again.
Thanks, Leah. I think you've actually responded it, because it was actually the same question on how can the treaty work to curb the power of pharmaceutical companies. And so I think you've actually said critical issues around the fact that we no longer need to rely on the self-regulation of corporations, because we can already see the damage that is caused with corporations being allowed to voluntarily report against their motives and abuses is not working. And I think you're spoken to that. The other question I would pose is to Gemma, and I think there's a lot of questions coming from the floor in terms of the ILO Convention and Decent Work Agenda and how that is being incorporated in our advocacy for the binding treaty. But then also, what are some of the mechanisms that are in place already in terms of holding corporate accountability, even as we pursue a binding treaty for corporations?
Because when it comes to decent work, because finally companies will have to respect human rights. And from a worker's perspective, which is also a feminist perspective, because, you know, we're women in the workers, if a corporation abuses a worker or workers that are trying to collectively bargain and discriminates against them, harms them physically in some way, fires them, as happens all the time all over the world, they would be able, you know, they would be held accountable for that. So what we ought to see from a treaty like this is an opening of space within multinational companies and hopefully local businesses that will enable workers to self-organise. When workers self-organise, we start to see a changing of the terms of debate within and how corporations have to remain responsible. So whether that's within the parent company or whether it's within their supply chains. And when we talk about the informal economy, which I saw from that question, there was a respect to the informal economy. Actually, you know, we know that in the UK, in Sialkot, in Pakistan, there are children making medical instruments that are used for surgery that are saving children's lives and everyone else's lives in the UK. Now, that is a supply chain issue with child labour in very, very informal types of work where it shouldn't be. So, you know, there are so many examples like this. It would be a total game changer. Just even on tax and the evasion of tax and what that means. Once workers get a collective bargaining agreement, they start, and once corporations realise and start acting maturely about it, you start to get a sharing of information because it's in the workers' interests to have healthy, strong businesses that are profitable because nobody wants to lose their job. And so from that point, you can also start to talk about business models and about how to do things better from a business perspective, but also from an ethically and more environmentally sustainable way. And when it comes to gender equality, that's the same with the question which was talking about getting gender equality in these transnational corporations. So yes, I mean, we constantly talk about having women workers, and indeed we want women workers on the boards and in the leadership and power structures. That work does go on. I can't personally speak to it myself. It's not an area that I focus on, but it absolutely goes on. This question on pharmaceuticals, it does go to that as well. So one of the ways of getting the pharmaceutical industry to be more accountable is if it's unionised, because again, the workers are the ones and their families and their communities that need access to these medicines. So we just need to get in there onto the boards, into collective bargaining agreements. We can put all of this stuff on collective bargaining agreements once we're there, but we have to get there, and that's what the binding treaty would do for us. I hope I answered everything. Maybe not, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Gemma. That was very, very comprehensive. And I think, yes, you did respond to everything. Just doing a time check, and I think this has been a very vibrant conversation, clearly one that is needed to be had more frequently and in different platforms and fora. Would unfortunately need to move to the final comments of the presenters. And so I'll just give an opportunity to the presenters to do 2 minutes each of their final comments. They will also, in their final comments, attempt to respond to all the questions that have been raised, but we will continue to monitor the chat box. And in case the question has not been raised, we will raise them either on social media or in the documentation that we'll send you with the webinar link. And I hope this is, please indulge me in this request. So over to you, Sonam.
Thanks, Philogene. I will not lie, this will take slightly more than 2 minutes. So I just want to, first of all, reiterate what was just said right now by Gemma. Unions make us strong. We need solidarity across unions, across the world. This is a key component. I want us to sort of just repeat that this is not going to be the only initiative. This is one initiative to bring corporations under regulation. And I know that there are some concerns that, but you know, some of these countries are weak and poor and the corporations are so much more powerful. That's true, but that's why we want this treaty to bring the state power on top. And it's true that while their economies and their geopolitical power might be less, in the General Assembly level, everybody has one vote. In the Human Rights Council, you have equal representation in terms of the geopolitics in every region. So we need to push our states to represent us. If we're real democracies, we need them to step up and pass something like this treaty, because this treaty then becomes a gateway to other demands that we need for corporate accountability. For example, country by country reporting of their taxes, so that we can see where exactly they're making their profits and where exactly they're paying the money. This is easier to understand in the context of extractives, because that's where the actual natural resources is coming from one spot. But in terms of manufactured goods, when one button is coming from here and and the cotton is coming from prison farms in America, and the fabric is being sewed into actual dresses in Bangladesh and Cambodia, it becomes more complicated. That's why following the taxes, following the money is really important. I also just want to add about the point on pharmaceuticals is that not only do we need unionization, but we also need to come back to what I said earlier about trade agreements. You know that a big part of the trade agreements is intellectual property. And do you know what falls under intellectual property? Medicines. What are pharmaceuticals globally trying to do? They're trying to patent everything so that they make money. And this is so glaringly, disgustingly obvious in the United States, where I just read a statistic that until last year, there's an antibiotic that's only sold by 2 companies in the US. And this antibiotic was being sold for something like $500 per bottle. But then each of the 2 companies started competing with each other and raising the prices to the point that it's now something like $1,000, $1,500 per bottle. This is an antibiotic that in Asia is 80 US cents for a bottle, because in Asia we make generic medicines. Our painkillers, our antibiotics, our HIV medication, our cancer medication is made patent-free, but in industries in India, in my country, Bangladesh, in Thailand. That's what, and this is a life and death question, because people need these medicines to survive, but pharmaceutical companies argue that, oh no, because we invested in the science to invent this, we get to profit as much as possible. So to challenge that, we need to challenge these intellectual property clauses in trade agreements, and that will be possible through a treaty that explicitly says human rights comes first over trade. Intellectual property is also covers the issue of seeds, which I won't go into, but also really, really important, especially for rural communities, rural women. I just want to also jump back to people are asking, oh, but how are we, are we talking to Google? Are we talking to Microsoft? Are we talking to the really big companies? So we're talking, and by we, I'm saying generally civil society as well as the UN. We're doing it on a few different levels. I will say that most of the stuff that the really big corporations are doing is fluff. They want to show us their corporate social responsibility. Coca-Cola wants to show us that they're giving jobs to women and helping them be economically empowered. Women don't need economic empowerment, they need economic rights. They need decent work, they need the realization of their fundamental human rights. That's where the empowerment conversation gets turned around by corporations. And on another level, we do try to talk to these companies about how they need to be they need to comply so that individual rights are not violated and they can be protected. And with the companies that people were asking about, like Google, Alphabet, and Microsoft, a lot of this conversation is coming around data and how you're handling data and sensitive data. The problem right now is that they're so massive that nobody really knows how do we make sure that international law applies to them. But the argument that Surya Deva from the Working Group on Business and Human Rights made was that, look, ultimately, a corporation is just a bunch of people, human beings, who are acting together. It doesn't mean, just because they're acting as a group doesn't mean that international law, national law doesn't apply to them. It still applies to them. So that's ultimately what it comes down to. But what really big multinational corporations have been doing is that they jump from jurisdiction to jurisdiction to try and get around their rules. That's why Facebook is headquartered in Ireland. That's why Amazon is headquartered in Luxembourg. And I will not take up any more time because, to be fair to the others. Thanks, Felicity.
Absolutely brilliant, Sanam. I mean, yes, you went over the 2 minutes, but critically, I think you raised very important issues that we need to bear in mind. And I'll move on quickly to Fernanda.
So thanks, everyone. This has been great. It's a privilege for me to be part of this great group of speakers, and thank you for such an engaging audience posing all this interesting and challenging questions to us. Maybe I would like to close stressing the importance of this issue for us as feminists, as women rights activists. I think that what we're seeing now internationally is an enormous increase of power and size and concentration of capital and wealth in the hands of, a few very, very big corporations that are having an increasingly big influence in multilateral spaces and in our countries at the national level, in our democratic institutions. And I think that combating corporate capture is essential, is very important, should be at the heart of many of the things we're doing, because we're seeing that human rights violations and different abuses that we are witnessing or suffering ourselves every day on the ground are caused increasingly by corporations rather than states. And this very blurred lines between the public and the private sphere, between states and corporations, it's a danger, and it's jeopardizing the fulfillment of our rights. And we should have this in mind and push for a process that is now in a very important moment. In the upcoming session of the IGWG, the Intergovernmental Working Group, in October 2018, there will be a lot of debate. There are some states that are against the process, and so participation now is essential, raising our voices as feminists, claiming for the continuation of the process and the inclusion of a gender perspective in the text is going to be very, very important. So I invite us all to stay involved and to understand that this process has brought very different movements together, and that finally, environmentalists, feminists, workers groups, unions, human rights organizations are coming together and joining, let's say, one voice internationally to push for transnational corporations to be really held accountable, to stop abuses, to stop corporate impunity, and to guarantee access to justice for victims. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Amazing, Fernanda. And thank you for also, in your 2 minutes, attempting to respond to the rest of the questions, which is much appreciated. We'll hear from Leah.
But I felt that the issues that Sanam raised specifically about the level of corporate capture for me underscores the difficulty of resisting the tyranny of corporate power. But I think one of the ways that that is going to happen is by giving people information. I was just reflecting on my preparation for this webinar, because this is not work that my organization works with explicitly, although we are very, very interested in decent work for women. And all the things that I discovered, and I realized that many women like myself do not have this information, and yet the tendrils of the corporations are taking root here in Uganda. But a lot of people do not know what's happening until it's too late, until they've been displaced and they don't know where to turn. But I can give a very quick example of something that happened about 3 years ago. A very large corporation wanted to take over land, and a group of older women stripped naked as a form of protest because they felt powerless, and that was the only power that they had left. And the company, the people that had gone to do a scoping of the land actually ran away and never returned. And that was a form of resistance that was recorded and is now being replicated in many parts of the country, but not always successfully. So, and I'll also reflect on a recent GMO bill that was passed in Uganda, and there was really no public debate. Nobody knows who Monsanto is until Monsanto will be here, and we'll be dealing with the repercussions of that, of them putting their roots here. So for me, my parting shot would really be that in order for us to resist these corporations effectively, in order for us to demand for accountability from the state so that they can also refuse these kinds of investments, is by empowering the people to actually demand for this change and this accountability themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah, for re-emphasizing how insidious and how corporate power is increasing in power, and what does that mean, especially when citizens are not able to advocate and speak out. And I think the message, the rallying call is, let's stop corporate abuse before it's too late. Let's resist corporate power before it gets out of hand. Over to you, Gemma.
There's a few points I want to make. First of all, we don't know whether this binding treaty is going to survive after the middle of October. I think, first of all, our job is to keep it alive by creating enough noise within civil society that they can't ignore us. I'd say that's our first thing. I think the other thing is, yes, I agree with the comments that have been made about the other instruments that exist, the UNGPs, the multinational guidelines, the decent work agenda, the ILO's work on global supply chains, etc. They're all really important, but at the moment they're kind of helping to, as well as being used by trade unions and others for the good, they are also helping to feed the £80 billion corporate fluffy social responsibility industry. And so are other things that are happening when they're too weak, like the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, which, whilst has galvanised discussion, CEOs are having to talk about modern slavery, it's so weak and so unbinding that it's also being able to be used as either to be ignored, to be for corporations to be able to pretend that they are abiding and complying, but actually they're doing nothing and nothing happens to them. So I think we need to get that binding treaty. We need to make sure that as organisations, when it comes to the tricky bits, that we don't get hung up on our differences too much. I think we've got to agree, and I believe that there's 5 common areas of priority that I think civil society is going to be trying to agree. We need to agree to those, and we need to stick to them, and we need to get a binding treaty. And I think there are individual things that can happen in individual countries. So instead of a Modern Slavery Act, what we need is something like the French vigilance law, which is saying that multinational corporations have a duty of care to carry out due diligence and to prove within that they haven't caused or contributed or been associated or linked with these types of issues. I think, just for time's sake, Leah, I'm going to message you about Uganda because I've got some ideas perhaps for who you could link up with in the trade union movement there, because it would be great if they don't already know what's going on. Perhaps you could go and have a chat with them, and I've got an idea about who you could talk to. I would just end by saying, if you're not already in a union, join one. If you're in a staff association for your NGO, which is, I'm sad to say, too normal, for lots of reasons they get set up, partly because unions are too political or they don't represent women well enough or whatever. The problem is that when we're not in a union, or if we're in an isolated staff association, we're not walking the talk. And we need to walk the talk, all of us. And so I would say become strong women within a trade union movement and help us to fight within to get what we need.
Thank you very much, Gemma. So the resistance is within and without, and even with alternatives. And I think that's a good segue to actually introduce Marion Sharples, who has been quite a graceful co-organizer of this webinar and is currently working for Gender and Development Network. And what she will do, because we've also gotten a lot of comments of some of the participants coming in late, and she will attempt to summarize the amazing discussions that we've had for the past 90 minutes in about 2 minutes. And so what are the key takeaways? What are some of the proposals that we're hearing out of this webinar? Yes, Marion.
Thank you so much, Felicine. And yeah, it's been a really inspiring hour and a half, and been fantastic to hear from all of our speakers and to co-organise this webinar. So thank you all very much. Yeah, we've had incredibly rich discussion today, and I'm not even going to attempt to summarise it, but what I will try to do is just to draw out some of the key themes which have come out throughout the session, both from our speakers and from the audience who've put in their questions. So firstly, we've heard a lot about power, and really the whole discussion around corporate accountability comes down to power imbalances and challenging the power that is held by transnational corporations, and of course, which can be supported by states as well, as we've seen in the whole discussion around corporate capture. And really, it's about reasserting the rights of citizens, human rights, women's rights, labour rights as primary, as number one, and about demanding that they take precedence over corporate interests and profits, as we've heard. And it's about uniting and pooling our power as feminist movements, as workers' movements, economic justice movements, climate justice movements, indigenous rights movements, and standing up to corporate power and corporate impunity. And another theme to come out of today, I think, is about opportunity. And as we've heard, civil society groups have been pushing for an international treaty that obliges transnational corporations to be held accountable for their actions now for over a decade. And we do now have a draft treaty, which, as we've heard, is going to be further elaborated and discussed next month at the 4th session of the Intergovernmental Working Group in Geneva. And there's several elements that we want to see included, which we've discussed today, such as a commitment to gender impact assessments conducted on the basis of free, prior and informed consent, a requirement of states to review all barriers that limit or impede access to justice and comprehensive reparation to women, and a requirement of states to create an environment conducive to the work of all human rights defenders, particularly women human rights defenders who face greater risks of violence, criminalisation, stigmatisation and harassment. This treaty is one of many avenues to corporate accountability, as we've heard, and there's still much work to be done, real opposition to be overcome, as we've discussed today, and indeed, as Gemma just said now, to keep it alive. But this is absolutely an important opportunity to tame the power of corporates. And thirdly, we've talked about collaboration, and the Feminist for a Binding Treaty movement has brought together women's rights organisations and NGOs, and unions, among others, to articulate our demands around the treaty, both in terms of process and content. And going back to that first theme of power, united we are more powerful, and pooling our resources, our knowledge and our expertise makes realising the treaty we want to see actually achievable, and more widely, ensuring that the systemic change that we need to see happens instead of focusing on single issue wins in silos. So on that note, I will pass back to Felicien to close the webinar, and who will explain about next steps going forward and how we can best collaborate going forward. But thank you very much to all our speakers, and also to Felicien for being an excellent chair this afternoon, and of course to all our audience members for their very active and enthusiastic participation.
Thank you very much, Marion, for capturing those salient points. Thank you very much to our audience. I know we have just been slightly over our agreed time for the webinar, but thank you so much. I can still see the numbers are quite high and the engagement is at its peak in the chats. So thank you so much for your indulgence, especially on these very important issues. We will record the webinar and share it with the emails that we have on the listserv. And also we'll try to continue to monitor the chat. And if there's anything that we can share more information around, we will accompany this with the communication to you. I would, in addition to our fantastic panelists, I think they have done an excellent job trying to capture conversations that usually take hours to have in very few minutes, and being very clear and articulate. And also for their time, because a lot, as you can see, they are quite committed to very important issues of our time, movement strengthening, movement support, and so just allocating this time to be in the panel. Thank you to Marion for the co-organizing of this webinar. And of course, we cannot forget our fantastic interpreters who did the amazing job of ensuring that we all have one conversation. And so to Sigrid and to Mariaho, thank you so much, and a fantastic job done. We look forward to having you in the struggle, and to continue to see you in the various spaces, and to continue this conversation in the online world via Twitter and via Facebook. Thank you so much, and have a good rest of day and good evening.